Transitions reveal more than just change. They reveal whether something was built to last. In ministry and in business, leaders come and go. Seasons shift, roles change, and yet too often the work itself depends almost entirely on the person holding the role. When they step away, momentum slows, the vision fragments, or the work just quietly fades. This isn't just a ministry problem, it's a leadership problem. And it shows up just as clearly in Christian-owned businesses, nonprofits, and faith-driven organizations as it does in churches. Today, I'm joined by Chuck Proudfit. He is the founder of At Work on Purpose, and our conversation looks at what continuity actually requires, why good intentions are not enough, and how leaders can think differently about legacy, succession, and the work God entrusts to them. Whether you're navigating a transition or leading an organization right now, this episode invites a deeper look at what it means to build something that continues beyond you. Welcome. This is the Life After Ministry podcast. Well, hey, welcome to the Life After Ministry podcast. My name is Matt Davis, and I'm here with a new friend, Chuck Proudfit. Hello, Chuck. We are connected through the internet, but we're only an hour away from each other. You're up in Cincinnati. I'm down in Lexington. How long have you been up there?
I've been in Cincinnati since 1987, except for a few years where I was living in a couple different places.
That's amazing. I want to hear a little bit of your background story. We have a good friend in common, Ron Henry, who said that we have to talk. And when I saw a little bit more about what you're doing, I said, we have to talk. So let's start a little bit earlier than that, though. What was your story of coming to faith in Jesus? Did you grow up in the church? Were you just marinated in it? Or was there a holy moment where all of a sudden you saw the light?
I was definitely not marinated in the church as a kid. I grew up on the front range of the Rocky Mountains in Boulder, Colorado. I was the son of two English professors, neither of whom was Christian. So I knew there were religious people, but I had no spiritual context for my young life. I did at Harvard University meet friends from all over the world. They represented all the faith traditions, and I started to become curious, but I put that on the back burner because the front burner was my emerging career. And I ended up in brand management at Procter & Gamble, so a multinational consumer products company in Cincinnati. And it was my frustration with that job that triggered a spiritual search. And there's a deeper story I can tell you there if you'd like. But essentially, after 10 years of studying comparative world religion and philosophy over the course of a corporate career, I became a Christian in my early 30s.
Did that lead you to getting into church right away? What was the before and after of what you thought about Christians from a distance, and then once you were actually on the other side?
I didn't know much about Christians going into my spiritual search. I mean, I knew that it was a predominant faith in the U.S., but I also knew that overseas there were many other faith traditions, and I wasn't predisposed. I was struggling to find purpose in my work life and more generally in my life. And that's what started the search. And so it was, for me, Matt, kind of like a giant funnel where you start at the top with all the stuff that you explore, in my case, the religions like Islam, Judaism, and so forth, and all these big questions. Salvation by grace or deeds, reincarnation, yes or no, one God or many gods, and stuff like that. And I ended up coming out the bottom of that funnel as a Christ follower. But I would tell you that my context for church at that point was really framed by my reading of the New Testament. And that's a very different animal than what I would call the institutional expression of church that we think about today, 2,000 years later.
What did that change, becoming a follower of Jesus? How did that change what you did in your work?
When you look at work through the lens of faith, you realize that if God's at the center of your life, then your life needs to be a form of worship. If one is committed to be faithful in life, then we have to be faithful at work. That was intuitive to me as a new believer because the early church, take the book of Acts, for example, is just filled with examples of faithful Christians making a big difference in and through the workplace. That's why I was stunned as I started, going to church regularly and getting involved in what we think of as church today, because the vast majority of working Christians go to church on Sunday and work on Monday, completely separating faith and work.
So how do you, or what was the instigating factor for you as you're starting to observe this, that, okay, number one, Christians live a very compartmentalized and divided life, and you start to get this idea that I'd like to do something about it?
For me, it was just this sense, it was a very personal sense that I wanted to live a worshipful life and that I needed to view work as worship. In my case, then it was, how do I bring faith into a young consulting practice, which at this point I had launched after leaving corporate America. In other words, a Christ-centered consultancy. It was an interesting journey for me, Matt, because I didn't have any role models. I didn't have a community of support. I didn't have a blueprint. I did early on discover some of the stuff that we encounter all the time in the workplace, that there are two things you're not supposed to talk about, religion and politics, that you have to be very thoughtful about how to translate what I'll call stained glass truth into plain glass language. There's just so many things I had to learn so that I could be faith active at work. And I think if I look back on it now, it was a great sandbox for me to experiment. But honestly, if I weren't an entrepreneurial person, in other words, I don't need to have the roads paved before I'll drive across the terrain. I'll go off road. I think for many Christians, faith at work is an awfully daunting proposition when you feel like you're facing it alone, that you don't see others doing that in the workplace and you feel intimidated.
It's interesting because a lot of people that we end up talking to on this podcast, they're moving from a ministry position, a nonprofit position, and some of them find themselves like a really good connection or next step for them is oftentimes a coaching or a consulting type of practice. They have an ability to communicate. They can see patterns. They can see structures, right? But they're trying to think, how do I do this in the workplace environment as a coach or as a consultant, and almost not be too Christian? And you're coming from more of a secular, and how do I actually engage this and bring this into it?
That's such a great point. I mean, let's put it this way. A word like coaching is plain glass, discipleship is stained glass. But I would argue that coaching is a form of discipleship. And, you can be coaching a pre-believer, somebody who's not yet a Christ follower, and introducing them to kingdom principles before they get to the point where they're willing to entertain a faith conversation about Christianity.
Have you seen, because you haven't been a pastor or in what we like in a nonprofit, in a church or missions agency type of position before. Have you seen some of these transitions take place in the church world, and what's been your perception of it? How does the church do when it comes to transitioning?
I would say that the church does a lousy job of transitioning people from what we would think of as institutional expressions of church out into ministry in a workplace context. I am actually an ordained minister. But the irony of that, Matt, was that at the time I was serving with a national entity that wanted to bring faith ministries into the local church that were focused on the workplace. And the only way that they would allow me to participate is if I was an ordained pastor. And so
Wow.
I became ordained because of that requirement. And it really walked me. I use that as an example of why I think those transitions can be so hard. For many people that they wouldn't admit it, if they're vocationally employed inside local churches and faith-based nonprofits, there's almost an unstated belief that, hey, I'm going to quit my job to go into ministry. But if I leave ministry, meaning vocational ministry, I've essentially left ministry for just a job. Now, that's a lie from the pit of hell. but I'm just telling you, we are programmed subconsciously to think that way. So when you're inside a local church, you see yourself as in ministry and you see your congregants as the laity who, are funding ministry work, but you don't really understand the dramatic opportunities for ministry in the day-to-day workplace.
Yeah, and I want to get to that in a second, but it's almost as if we have allowed the IRS to determine what makes ministry and what doesn't, what makes ministers and what doesn't, right? Because we used to joke that if you're a pastor, then you get to marry, bury, dip, and sip, right? Those are what are called the sacerdotal duties. And if you're not a pastor, if you're not licensed, if you're not ordained, then you're not doing those things, and therefore you're not in ministry. So what are some of those steps that people can take to think and think about this in a couple ways? Because I think you have a very unique perspective. What does it look like for somebody who is entering the marketplace, maybe coming from a ministry position? But let's also speak to the person who's listening, who is already in the marketplace, who's not thinking that there is that sacred secular divide, and they haven't necessarily worked that in. How do you do that without coming off as cheesy or the guy that everybody has to avoid in the office? What does that naturally look like?
For me, I think of it from the inside out and the outside in. So from the inside out, it's mindset. We have to view ourselves as on mission wherever we're working. If we really believe Scripture that God's prepared good works in advance for us to do, if we really believe that Old Testament word avodah, that work is worship, if we really believe Colossians that we should do our work as unto the Lord, not unto men, then there's no way from the inside out that we can look at work as anything less than a form of worship and an opportunity for ministry. And I would add to that the typical working Christian has a sphere of influence of over 300 people, whereas the average local church congregation has under 100 people. So if we start to shift our mindset from saying I'm employed in the workplace to saying I'm deployed in the workplace by the Lord strategically to be on mission with the people that are surrounding me. And I know that sounds very high level, but it's a big deal to believe that on the inside, because that's how we conquer the first demon, which you referenced, the sacred secular divide. That's a great lie from Satan that work is secular and off limits to faith. But the hard truth is that an awful lot of us buy into it.
Yeah.
The second thing I would say is that when we're thinking about ministry in the workplace, we have to let go of all of the programmatic trappings that go with ministry in the traditional context, like the local church, and think organic instead of programmatic. So as I'm going along in the workplace and I'm encountering people, I'm figuring out what it looks like to be there for them. I think Jesus spoke to this prescriptively in Luke chapter 10. He's sending out the disciples in teams of 2 to surrounding towns and villages to share the good news. And he basically says to them, bless the people that you encounter. Give them a warm greeting. If they're not friendly, then dust off your sandals and move on. If they are, however, spend time with them, get to know who they are, break bread with them so you fellowship. And then from there, you start to learn their story. Like who are they and what do they do and what do they need? And you begin to learn how you can minister to their felt needs, which may or may not be in the workplace per se, but you met this person through work. And so that's the point of inception. And then as you've earned the credibility to speak, you tell them that the kingdom of God has come near. In other words, you proclaim Christ as the reason for your motivation. When they ask you why you want the extra mile to be there for them at work.
So you've obviously put a little bit of thought into this. This is not a side hobby or maybe an article that you wrote one time, but you actually got to the point of wanting to start something. You lead an organization called At Work on Purpose. What was the agitation? What was the moment that you said, I think that we need to talk about this a little bit more than this just being my own personal mission?
That moment was what you and I were speaking about earlier. When I came to Christ after having recently launched a consulting firm, I spent several years learning how to be faith active at work myself. realizing that I was willing to do that as an entrepreneurial personality, but most working Christians aren't like that. They're not wired that way. They need pathways. They need people to show them how. They need role models, and they need a community of support. In the earliest days where I started, Matt, honestly, I just wanted a life group for work life, just a group of Christians committed to the idea of faith at work, that we could just meet a couple times a month and talk about that idea. There wasn't any curriculum or anything, but the Holy Spirit moved in these meetings. We had about a dozen people whom I recruited from around the city. And amazingly enough to me, over the course of about 6 months, entirely through word of mouth, with no intent to be more than a little life group, we ended up with over 300 people involved. And today there are over 15,000 working Christians involved with that work on purpose across greater Cincinnati. All of them have the common cause of Christ at work. And they come from different church homes, denominations, zip codes around the city. In a sense, it is the church at work in a city.
What is the structure then? So how do you guys meet? What is that deployment looking like, and how does somebody step in and say, "All right, I'm ready to do this"?
Sure. It's akin to LinkedIn. So, you discover a person or some sort of a project or initiative through LinkedIn that you're interested in, and you opt in, right? You just want to be involved, and you want to be notified when stuff's happening, and you participate with those things that are of interest to you. And for the other stuff, you just let that go. That's what this is like. Our job as a ministry is essentially to be a decentralized and organic network of spiritual influence that canvasses our geographic area. I think the early church was organized this way. It was an ecclesia. It was the body of Christ, primarily in the workplace. And I think that's why in the New Testament, we see these books named after cities, right? Ephesus and Corinth and so forth. And to us, it's just a natural idea that you build relationships with each other. It's a network. It's who you know, not what you know. That we want to be a good witness at work. We want to set a good example so other people are attracted to that example. And that collectively, we can seek the peace and prosperity of the city where we work and where we live.
What's the fruit that you're seeing from this? The 15,000 people deployed into the workplace to live out their faith. I know a lot of churches will have the little sign as you leave the parking lot. It says, "Now entering the mission field." I'm not sure what we all do with that. But what do you see, and how's that changing Cincinnati?
For us, we've seen a process of what I'll call spiritual formation in and through the workplace. The language that we use is purposeful employment, followed by contextualized discipleship, followed by ministry reapplication. And to unpack those just a little bit, our objective with a working Christian is first to help them understand that God has a purpose for their work that isn't just about making money, to pay the bills or getting a set of tasks done that meet the immediate needs of your employer. It's actually looking at your work as a platform for bringing the kingdom of God to life in your sphere of influence. So purposeful employment is the place where we start. And what that looks like is discipleship. We would typically call it equipping or coaching. We have some things that we can offer that help people with that. But we've discovered over the years, Matt, that community trumps content every single time. If we can introduce working Christians to each other, they help each other day to day, especially in similar workplaces. So it starts with purposeful employment, but contextualized discipleship is about figuring out how to be faith active in my work environment. If I'm a city council person, if I've been elected to a public office, that looks very different than, let's say, being the entrepreneur who's started up a business that has a dozen employees now, and I'm the CEO. Those are two very different roles, and faith integration or faith expression looks very different. So it's really important to have people that understand the kind of work you're doing, helping you figure out how to do that work from a faith perspective. So that's the second part. And that third part, ministry reapplication, is taking the faith at work expressions that are working and sharing them with others so that we can start through that network to share ideas back and forth, and not just in our own geographic area.
You have an expression of this coming up this year in the Faith at Work Summit. What's your focus going to be for this year?
The Faith at Work Summit is focused on the future of faith in the workplace. So the title is Frontiers, and we're focused on the three chief constraints that currently impede the progress of faith in the workplace: creativity, collaboration, and continuity. Creativity, or lack thereof, is, we need to think differently. We have to get outside of our boxes to imagine what's possible with ministry in the day-to-day workplace. Collaboration, in the spirit of John 17, is working Christians and workplace ministries actually working with each other. And most of the time, they're as territorial as local churches and denominations. And the third area is continuity. It's not unlike your focus on ministry transitions. Continuity is a huge challenge in the faith at workspace. What often happens is people work for years with a certain initiative or ministry idea, and then it dies with them. It does not pass forward. The torches aren't passed well. Leadership lapses cause all kinds of continuity problems. It's just a major issue.
That's probably the place where we have the greatest crossover. And I'm curious what you've seen with that. Either CEOs that are staying too long or they don't know what to move to. What's the greatest enemy in terms of continuity and legacy with what you're seeing in the workplace?
The single biggest issue is that the leaders that would like to continue whatever it is that they've been doing are not building ahead of time the infrastructure that they need to leave something behind that continues to work. And that means raising up new people to lead it. It means systems or ways of doing things where it can be shared and it's not just in your head. I know none of this sounds, anything more than common sense. The problem is it's not very common.
Yeah. Yeah, we see it all the time. And it's from people who refuse to leave, or we oftentimes will see leaders that just don't have a clear enough vision for what their track is. And oftentimes what we're doing is we're working with both organizations and individuals. And I think a lot of times in terms of succession, the biggest question is, well, what happens to the organization after person X leaves? Will the organization continue to thrive? The problem is that person will stay there until they actually have a good vision for what their individual life looks like. And so we go through a process. We have a framework for thinking through transition for that individual before it ever even gets brought up with the organization. But how do we kind of take stock of where we've been and what our life experience has been? And then we take aim. What do you want to do next? Because just because you are moving from a pastoral or ministry vocational role to a marketplace role doesn't mean that your job is done. And even when you move into a retirement season, that doesn't mean that you stop, right? I believe retirement is when God says, I'm done with you, and now we're going to take you up. That's when you stop. And then how do we start to take some actual steps towards that next season of life? And so bringing those together, when you have a clear vision for a leader of here's what your next thriving season looks like, now we can build that out and let's take the steps necessary for your organization to start taking some of those same steps. And what it ensures is legacy on both ends. There's a personal and family legacy that takes place, and there's an organizational legacy to make sure that that mission that you started a long time ago continues on into the future.
I agree with all of that. In addition, there's often a body of work, life's work that doesn't necessarily have to be transported into the future as an ongoing organization. Potentially, it's material that could be reshaped or formed or absorbed into something else or with someone else. However, there are so many disconnections in the workplace because of a lack of collaboration that people don't know each other, how they could share ideas, pick up the mantle for somebody's work. And so often it just dies on the vine.
What do you think? I'm sure you have a lot of experience with boards and how boards interact in relation to the teams that are running some of these organizations. What's something that a board could do to help their organization in being more proactive in terms of continuity?
I think if a board is proactively asking a couple really important questions, first of the current leader, what's your vision for you professionally 10 years from now? It's like, is it still the same? And, if it's obvious that that person wouldn't be leading within 10 years and yet they have no idea of what might be next, that's a red flag.
Yeah.
Because they need to be thinking ahead about that. The second question, though, is just as important. If that person decided to, move to Hawaii tomorrow and just vanish, how would the organization operate? And often what you discover is that there's this huge vacuum.
Yeah. And I think oftentimes what gets left in that vacuum is we have staff and teams. There's a panic that starts to set in, and we start to plug holes rather than to position people. And that's where I think that you can start to have drift for both your mission, for your ministry, whatever that might look like. I'm curious, I didn't ask you, but when is the Faith at Work Summit happening this year?
Yes, the Faith at Work Summit is in Cincinnati from June 17th through 19th. There's a website, Faith at Work Summit 2026.org. It's easy to spot, but it's a premier global gathering for Faith at Work. So there will be people from all over the world traveling for this, and some really excellent material that some neat people are presenting with some very engaging formats, not just to present content, but to think about interactive conversation and application. So I'm super excited about it.
Well, Chuck, obviously close enough for me to take a little drive up there, and would love to be able to join you. Want to invite others who are listening in if you are in the area, and even if you're not. We live in the day of planes, trains, and automobiles. You can get there. And so, Chuck, thank you for the good work that you're doing for Cincinnati, and I'm sure that bleeds into all of the areas surrounding. But thank you for your work and what God has called you to, and for joining us on the podcast today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Matt.
If you want to explore these ideas further, check the show notes for this episode. You'll find links to Chuck's work with At Work on Purpose, details about the Faith at Work Summit, and resources focused on faith, leadership, and continuity in the workplace. And if you happen to be navigating a leadership transition or helping an organization prepare for one, visit ministrytransitions.com. We offer confidential conversations that are designed to help leaders and organizations move forward in ways that protect people, preserve your purpose, and then plan well for what's next. Good work, we believe, deserves a future, and continuity is one of the ways that we steward it well. Thank you for listening to the Life After Ministry podcast.